Stay tuned. Ahead, I'll talk with Clayton Page Aldern about the weight of nature, how a changing climate changes our brains. Hi, I'm Dan Skinner, and this is Some Books Considered. A bit about the author. Clayton Page Aldern is a journalist with master's degrees from the University of Oxford in both neuroscience and public policy. He's currently a senior data reporter for Grist, but he's also written for The Atlantic, The Guardian, The Economist, and more. And his work has been presented on the floor of the U.S. Senate. Clayton, welcome to Some Books Considered.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
Well, when did you first become aware of this connection between climate change and our brains?
This has been a subject of inquiry for me for something on the order of a decade at this point. I studied as a neuroscientist in grad school and ultimately decided I wasn't interested in sitting in front of a computer and looking at a screen the rest of my life in a windowless basement, as my grad school experience had led me to believe would be my future. But I was still interested in working on questions of the brain and the mind, right? This is one of the miracles of the universe, the fact that we can perceive our reality and understand ourselves through this organ. And I left the lab with an interest in communicating some of that majesty. And where did I find a spot to think about some of these questions? Ultimately, it was at a climate magazine. And an editor there said, well, hey, you're a former neuroscientist. Surely you can write some series for us on this is your brain on climate change, right? And I feared at the time that this would have been a mode of immediately alienating all of my former neuroscience colleagues because it's a field that's so readily sensationalized. But with a little bit of inquiry, it became clear that some of the threads that I started to pull at in that moment did indeed lead to a greater narrative. And it's the continuation of the polling at these threads over the past, let's call it 7 years, that have ultimately resulted in the book before you. I initially suspected this was just going to be a story of heat and aggression, for example. That's a really obvious behavioral effect that we can all feel and indeed perhaps all have. But it has been over the course of researching this text that I've found the story to just be so much deeper than that.
Well, before we talk about some of the specific information in this book, give us a brief overview. What are readers going to find here?
Sure. I like to say that this is a story of the climate changing us from the inside out, right? We tend to think about climate change as this future threat, right? It's a story of sea level rise and extreme heat in 2100. And very frequently it's also happening in some other place, right? It's never a story of our personal lives. And this book pushes back against that argument. It says that environmental change is affecting our inner worlds today, right? And again, the heat and aggression example is a useful place to start insofar as we've all felt aggressive on a hot day, right? We've all maybe felt a little quicker to the trigger when it's hot out. And this is a universal animal experience, right? That is something that brains do, right? Psychologically speaking, we are primed toward aggression in hotter weather. And so that's one example of the behavioral effects of a changing climate, right? Others include the fact that we're also not as good at taking tests in the heat, right? We don't perform as well cognitively on hot days. But it's also true that climate change is expanding the habitable range of disease vectors like ticks and mosquitoes that act on brain tissue, right? Through things like cerebral malaria and Powassan virus and, all the things that you kind of don't want to get a diagnosis of, right? So there's a story of brain health as it relates to the climate that is less a function of psychology and more a function of physical interactions we have with a changing environment and how those interactions affect brain matter. And then I think there's a broader story to tell with respect to a certain intimate relationship that can be revealed with our environment through an understanding of these changes. And that's kind of what I cover in the last third of the book. This is a slightly more subtle story, a manner in which the climate is sneaking into our sensory systems, right? It can corrupt modes of perceiving the world, like olfaction and audition, right? Smelling and hearing. We see chemical changes in the environment affecting animals in this way. And of course, there's no reason to believe that that's not also true of us. And so broadly speaking, the overview here is one that says climate change is a story of today, not a story of 2100. And it's not a story of that other place and future time and other people. It's a story of what's happening inside of us right now.
I'm curious, as you lay it out there, it seems obvious that yes, it's going to impact us both physically and emotionally. You know, a lot of people have anxiety about this, maybe even anger about it. Why isn't something being done? And I wonder about why this isn't a part of the discussion. You know, we talk about climate change, how it impacts the environment, how it impacts various species that maybe will become extinct because of it. But we don't talk about this aspect of it. What do you think that is?
I think in part it's because while intuitive, many of these effects maybe aren't internalized until they're pointed out, right? It's not very common that when we feel a burst of aggression or feel indeed the opposite thereof, right? A sense of fatigue or sleepiness, for example, that who knows, maybe as a function of not having gotten a lot of sleep the night before because it was particularly warm as a function of a changing climate, right? We tend not to link those everyday moments to broader forces, right? To broader structural or environmental forces until those degrees of interaction are pointed out. And so I think part of the story here is we simply haven't amassed a consensus narrative. We haven't had any ideas along these lines that have really managed to spread themselves throughout our society. But I do think that there's something to be said for the act of storytelling along these lines, because as soon as we do start to make the connections, they seem so much more obvious, right? They seem indeed intuitive.
I'm talking with Clayton Page Aldern about the weight of nature, how a changing climate changes our brains. And our conversation continues in a moment. If you appreciate this discussion, please subscribe, like, and click on the bell so you'll know when I post new interviews. And thank you. Part of my thinking, maybe this is probably why you wrote the book, is that, yes, it does need to be more forefront in the discussion about climate change because we see this as an existential threat. And we see that this is something that a lot of us feel frustrated about, maybe feel helpless about. So what can we do? But adding that extra dimension is, yes, that impacts you on an individual level in terms of your own mental health, gives it a whole different dimension.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And in terms of the what can we do question, it's challenging because I don't want to make the argument that people themselves, one by one at an individual level, are responsible for the climate crisis and therefore responsible for responding to it at that individual level, right? I think that broadly speaking, the climate crisis is still a story of systemic and structural violence, right? And ought to be addressed accordingly as a function of industrial policy and governmental action. And at the same time, when we think about the fact that indeed we're seeing less progress than we need to on the issue, the question of what people can do themselves does become relevant, especially when we're talking about things like neurological and psychological resilience. So yes, I mean, I think it's true that without wrapping our heads around this problem, without bringing it to the forefront, the fact that a changing climate is bearing on the risk of, various neurodegenerative disorders, right, and bearing on the risk of violence to a certain extent, right? That's a societal issue and one that it is appropriate to price and respond to as a government. And I think at the individual level, understanding these connections that we're beginning to piece together in terms of our relationship with the environment, it can be really useful to offer a little bit of a reframe in my estimate, right? Because so much of what I talk about in this book is evidence of the environment reaching in, right? It's crossing that boundary that we like to imagine exists between our inner worlds and the outer world out there. And obviously the story we're telling here says that boundary is a lot more porous than we tend to acknowledge on a day-to-day level. I think, however, pointing out that porousness and really wrapping our heads around it, it gives us a certain degree of agency insofar as it reminds us that we can reach out in the other direction, right? That we can also cross that boundary between self and world, right? That we have the ability, I would argue, to affect change in our environments just as it appears they are changing us, right? And so what does a more agency-driven approach to understanding the world look like? I mean, I think it looks a lot like mindfulness, for example, which is very frequently spoken about in kind of new age terms. But there's actually a lot of really compelling neuroscientific evidence there that would suggest engaging in these modes of mindful awareness, right? Engaging in these modes of kind of steady presence with our environments, noticing and naming the manners in which we relate to them, and then being able to move on, right? Name and acknowledge and then move on to other ways that we might be feeling and other modes of interacting with our world. That's how I think that we can begin to put one foot in front of the other again, right?
So it sounds like in dealing with this, there are many different approaches, but I think, obviously this is a global issue and individuals can lend their support to changes in how the world operates to try to help control climate change or deal with the effects of climate change. But then you talk about what we can do individually and how do we adapt and how do we protect ourselves from those changes, which you addressed a bit there. But what else might you say about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I like to think about the word environment, broadly speaking. We use the word environment today to mean things like trees and water and air, but it also includes the built environment, right? This set of structures and pathways for navigating our world that have been entirely erected by people, right? Buildings and streetscapes. And that there are actually quite a few interventions that we can make at the level of the built environment that make our relationship with a changing world writ large a little more navigable, right? And so, of course, I'm talking about things like air conditioning and air filtration systems, but I'm also thinking about the manners in which we can make our cities more resilient to heat writ large, right? And that's stuff like reflective glass and more shaded structures and green space and facades of buildings that shade themselves, right? There are plenty of architectural innovations, both contemporary and frankly ancient, that go a long way toward bolstering the resilience of a city in the face of something like extreme heat, right? So I think that there are climate adaptation approaches that are really useful to wrap our heads around here. I think more broadly, we're not going to confront this crisis, the climate crisis writ large, unless we are appropriately accounting for all of its effects, right? For better or for worse, climate policy runs on cost-benefit analysis. And if we are not appropriately accounting for something like the neurological effects of the climate crisis, we are not fully pricing the problem. And that means that as a government, it's a lot harder to justify climate action, right? Because you're not assessing the extent to which your investments as a government might be offsetting the societal costs in question. And so I think one of the greatest steps that we could take as a society is trying to put a price tag on some of the effects that we're talking about, trying to put a price tag on what the projected future violence as a function of climate change might be, as well as a price tag on the effects of future neurodegeneration as a matter of changing environments. And I think once we have some dollars and cents in play. For better or for worse, it's the kind of hard evidence in economic terms that allows us to put these often slightly more nebulous relationships on the same par as some of the technological investments that we're making.
Well, there's much more in this book that we won't have time to talk about. What would you say are the key concepts that you hope readers are going to take away?
Well, I think we've touched on a lot of them. One is certainly that this notion of a boundary between self and environment is a little more complicated than we tend to expect. There's a porousness there that allows signals from the environment to influence our inner worlds and allows our actions to impress themselves upon the world. So that's an important point. I think another important point to make here is that when we think about something like free will, it's so frequently understood as this notion that guides morality, right? That if we have free will, then morality matters. And I think something about the climate reaching in and forcing our hand, right? Heat driving behavior, for example, it compromises free will a little bit, right? And we say something like, gosh, maybe we didn't have as much as we thought. And so what does that mean for morality? What does it mean to be making decisions or thinking that we're making decisions when it may be the case that the environment is reaching in a little bit and tipping the scales? And I would argue that one of the most important points in this book is that even when free will might be out the window a little bit, and hey, maybe it's out the window the entire time, that doesn't excuse us from acting without compassion, right? Compassion still matters because we still have the sense that we have free will. And it is that sense that I would argue rescues morality. So yes, this is a book about climate change. It's a book about the brain, but more broadly, it's a book about our relationships with the world around us and with one another.
To learn more, the book is The Weight of Nature: How a Changing Climate Changes Our Brains by Clayton Page Aldern. Clayton, thank you for talking with me today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
If you'd like to purchase The Weight of Nature, I've placed a link for you in the description below. And if you'd like to see more videos about books and their authors and a wide variety of topics, be sure to subscribe, like, and click on the bell to be notified about future programs. I'm Dan Skinner. Thank you for watching this edition of Some Books Considered.